Psalm 52. The title I've used to summarize this poem is The Foolish Faith of the Proud Man. This is another psalm that comes out of the life of David from a key event in his life, and he writes it about a character who caused much harm. So before we get into our handout, let's take a look at the psalm itself. Psalm 52, it has a long heading. For the choir director, a maskil of David, when Doeg the Edomite came and told Saul and said to him, David has come to the house of Ahimelech. Why do you boast in evil, O mighty man? The loving kindness of God endures all day long. Your tongue devises destruction like a sharp razor, O worker of deceit. You love evil more than good, falsehood more than the speaking what is right. Selah. You love all words that devour, O deceitful tongue. But God will break you down forever. He will snatch you up and tear you away from your tent and uproot you from the land of the living. Selah. The righteous will see and fear and will laugh at him, saying, Behold, the man who would not make God his refuge, but trusted in the abundance of his riches, and was strong in his evil desire. But as for me, I'm like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the loving kindness of God forever and ever. I will give thanks forever because you have done it. And I will wait on your name, for it is good in the presence of your godly ones. What an interesting, different kind of psalm this is. We'll talk about the setting first if you look on your handout. Of course, David is the author, and we mentioned last week that there are about 20 psalms in a row now that are written by David. There's, I think, one that doesn't have his name on it, and it might still be by him, but we're in another long section of Psalms by David. And the background to it, as the heading tells us, is the betrayal of David and Ahimelech to Saul. And this is a story that is told to us in 1 Samuel 22. And the culprit who does this is Doeg, the Edomite, a man who's not mentioned much in the Bible, but nothing good is said about him at all. In fact, he seems to inspire an entire psalm largely directed at his judgment. Doeg was one of King Saul's officials in charge of the royal shepherds. And we're going to turn in a moment to 1 Samuel 21, but let's make our way through the handout a little bit. He was also, in addition to the head of the shepherds, he was also a military strongman. He's a strong man. Now, isn't it interesting that he's not an Israelite, he's an Edomite, so they're distantly related to the Israelites. That in itself is not necessarily a bad thing. The Edomites were, in general, not a good bunch, but it was customary for kings to have some officials who were not of their native nation. For instance, one of David's key men that we brought up last week in Psalm 51, Uriah the Hittite. It's not an Israelite. So it's not unusual for kings to bring in an outsider into some trusted positions. How about Daniel? Daniel is not a Babylonian. He's not a Persian, but he's put in a position. How about Joseph? He's not an Egyptian, but he's put in a place of position. This happens quite a lot in royal courts to bring in an outsider. Part of the thinking seems to be you bring in an outsider, they're not going to succeed in overtaking the throne. They don't have the family support, the tribal support to do that. And in that case, they're considered to be more trusted. So he's in charge of the royal shepherds, but he's also a strong man. And David had been on the run from Saul when he found assistance at the village of Nob, where the tabernacle was set up. 1 Samuel 21 tells us about this. And it seems like when David is there at Nob, or Nob is probably the better way to say it, Doeg is there and he fakes support for David's getting asylum there. But then he turns around and reports the incident to Saul, and Saul commands that all of the priests there be killed, and the soldiers don't want to do it, so Doeg does it himself. You can see on the map there, does anyone remember what is the capital of King Saul's, where is his throne set up at? You remember, it's not Jerusalem. It's, you see there at the top of the map, number 1, Ramah. That's where King Saul set up his throne. So David has fled there, and he's gone down to Nob. It's not that far away. And when Saul has moved down to Gibeah, that's where he hears about that David had been there, that the priests at Nob, where the tabernacle was, that they'd given shelter to David, and he's furious, and the priests are slaughtered. It almost shuts down the tabernacle completely. Meanwhile, David flees down to the far left of your map. There's a place called Adullam. There's caves there. And he flees to Adullam, and there he is protected from Saul's rage for a time. Let's turn back in our Bibles to 1 Samuel 21, and we'll read a little bit of this story. This is the story, by the way, that our Lord Jesus refers to as teaching that there are sometimes exceptions to the protocols of the law. Sometimes to do good is more important than to follow the strictest protocols of things. Chapter 21, verse 1, Then David came to Nob to Ahimelech the priest. And Ahimelech came trembling to meet David and said to him, Why are you alone and no one with you? David said to Ahimelech the priest, The king has commissioned me with the matter, and he said to me, Let no one know anything about the matter which I'm sending with you, in which I've commissioned you, and I've directed the young men to a certain place. Now, therefore, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever can be found. The priest answered David and said, There is no ordinary bread on hand, but there's consecrated bread. If only the young men have kept themselves from women. David answered the priest and said to him, Surely women have been kept from us as previously when I set out the vessels of the young men were holy, though it was an ordinary journey. How much more than today will their vessels be holy? So the priest gave him consecrated bread, for there was no bread there but the bread of the presence, which was removed from before the Lord, in order to put hot bread in its place when it was taken away. A very quick summary of this. David says, I'm on an important mission. We need some food, and they say all we have is the ceremonial bread that has been before the presence of God. Normally we can't serve that. Have your men kept themselves pure? I mean, we don't want to commit something sacrilege, and David assures them that it's fine. So this unusual measure of giving them consecrated bread is done because of an extreme situation. And verse 7 now brings us to the psalm. Now one of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord, and his name was Doeg the Edomite, the chief of Saul's shepherds. David said to Ahimelech, Now is there not a spear or a sword on hand? For I brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's matter was urgent. The priest said, The sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, behold, it is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. You shall take it to yourself. Take it, for there is no other except it. And David said, There is none like it. Give it to me. David arose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath. And the story goes on. We're told in the next chapter that Doeg rats out David and his men and tells them where he'd been. So apparently, while he was there, he seemed all agreeable. But then, when David was gone, Doeg reports back to Saul what had happened, and this sends Saul in a furious rage, resulting in the death of the priest Ahimelech and many other priests. David has to flee to the cave of Adullam. Well, let's go to the inside panel, your handout. We'll say something else about the setting of the psalm. And now we're going to talk about not the setting in history so much as the placement. I've shared with you many times before that these psalms are not arranged in the order in which they were written. They are arranged for different reasons and different ways. So like Psalm 51 was from David's time with Bathsheba. That's midway through his reign. This story is before he becomes the king. So look at the list there. Psalm 50 is Asaph singing out an indictment against Israel. It's rebuking Israel for its sin. Psalm 51 is David confessing his own sin. Psalm 52 is another indictment of a self-reliant man, Doeg. And then Psalm 53 is going to be another indictment of a godless fool. Psalm 53, the famous line, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." So there's 4 psalms in a row that all have to do with sin being confronted or in some case confessed. So what kind of psalm is this? This is a very different kind of psalm. Just like Psalm 50, which we looked at earlier in the month, it's hard to classify it. There's about a dozen different kinds of psalms that most psalms are, and this one just does not neatly fit it. I mean, it sounds at first like it's a lament, that there's a bad man doing bad things, and yet David never prays for help. He never calls out for deliverance. There's a sense in which there's instruction in this. I mean, don't be like Doeg, be like David. That's implied, but it's never explicitly stated that way. The way the wicked man is condemned in the psalm sounds like a prophet indicting people for their sin. The prophets, a lot of the prophetic writings are indictments, but this is not normal for what you'd use in a psalm of worship. So I think that what's interesting is that the psalm ends with a confession of trust. There's a confession of trust at the end of the poem that I think colors the whole thing. This is, of all the parts in the psalm, this is the part that's most familiar to other psalms, most similar to other psalms. David will say, for instance, in verse 9, "But as for me, verse 8, I'm like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the loving kindness of God forever. I will give thanks forever, because you have done it. I will wait on your name." These are expressions of confidence and trust. And this idea of trust is also brought up when talking about the wicked man in verse 7. "Behold the man who would not make God his refuge, but trusted in the abundance of his riches, and was strong in his evil desire." So David's confession of trust is in contrast with the proud man's foolish trust in himself. So this seems to be a kind of psalm of trust. It's a different kind of psalm of trust. The most classic psalm of trust is probably Psalm 23. "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He does this for me and that for me and that for me and this for me. And even though that happens, he does this for me." That's a classic psalm of trust. This is a kind of a variant on that. It has a little bit of that element as well as some other things within it also. We'll find out in future studies. Psalm 58 is also very much like Psalm 52. It has a very similar feel. So the structure of this psalm, Psalm 52, there are 4 verses of indictment where this proud man is condemned. There are 3 verses that explain the judgment that he's going to face, and then it ends with a celebration of trust in the last 2 verses. There are 2 times in the poem that the word Salah shows up. Now, many times in the Psalms, Salah marks the end of a section, but it doesn't do it here. In this case, it seems to mark verses that are extraordinary for what they're saying. It forces you to pause and think about either the awfulness or the awesomeness of what had just been said. So it highlights incredible statements that are worth reflecting on. And if the word Salah is a musical note, which I think it is, it might indicate that the musicians are to play an interlude or to repeat something so that there be time for some reflection. So I think there's 3 main points to this psalm. And yet there's also another way of outlining the poem, another layer of structure that focuses on different persons. Different persons. For instance, the first 4 verses are all about the proud man, and it's spoken directly to him. You. Look at verse 52, verse 52, verse 1 of Psalm 52. "Why do you boast in evil, O mighty man? Verse 2, your tongue devises destruction. Verse 3, you love evil more than good. Verse 4, you love all words that devour. You. There's the first person. And then beginning in verse 5, then there's a he. But God, he will break you down forever. He will snatch you up and tear you away. And then verses 6 and 7, there's the righteous. Verse 6, the righteous, and that's plural. The righteous, they will laugh at him. And then lastly, beginning in verse 8 and 9, there's I, David himself. So there's a different shift as we move through the poem, focusing on indicting, confronting that evil man, referring to God, and then speaking about how God's people will respond to all of that. And lastly, by looking at David thinking of himself. Let me make a few notes and applications before we get into the visual outline. This poem may reveal to us more about the story in 1 Samuel 21 and 22. And I already alluded to this, that the story tells us that Doeg is a bloodthirsty man, violent man, willing to kill anybody. And yet this psalm focuses more on his dishonesty. David is accustomed to dealing with violent people, but dishonest people are especially treacherous and dangerous. So what the psalm suggests is that not only was Doeg there when David came and got assistance and got some armament, Goliath's sword, but that he passed himself off as, oh, this is good, yeah, help out David. And then turned around right away and snitched on him. And resulted in David having to flee further and go into deeper hiding. Another note about the psalm, letter B, there's a reference in verse 6 and 7 to the righteous laughing at the judgment of the wicked man. Verse 6, the righteous will see and fear and will laugh at him, saying, behold the man who would not make God his refuge. You don't want to read that as if this is some sort of self-righteous gloating, that we're just happy when people fall under judgment. That's not the idea. The laughter of the righteous to God's judgment here is not sinful gloating. It's more of a cheer of relief. When a strong man who's been committing atrocities and is on the rampage is finally stopped, people are happy. When these militiamen in third world countries who are wreaking havoc and killing thousands of people so that they can have their ideology satisfied or their thirst for money satisfied, when they're put to an end, there's a relief. Yes, it's on one level, it's a sad thing that they've been so sinful and that they've been judged, but it's also a joy to see that there is justice. And that's the idea here, the laughing, it's a laugh of relief. He seemed so strong, he seemed so powerful, it seemed like nobody could stop him, but that's not the way it works. God is greater. God is better. It's better for us, it has been better for us to have put our trust in God than to be like him who put his trust in his wealth and his weapons and everything else that he had. One last thing I'll note before we go into the visual outline. There are two really strong contrasts that run through this psalm between the wicked man and the righteous man. The first contrast is what they trust in. The wicked trust in themselves. In the case of Doeg, he trusts in his physical power, in his military prowess, and his wealth is implied here too. As the head of the royal shepherds, he's a man of influence, a man of money. He has his own business. He's kind of like a mobster in a way. He's got a business, and then he's got a business. And he trusts in himself. And yet David is learning to trust in God. David's on the run. David's being hunted. David's life is in jeopardy, but he trusts in God. And in the end, David's situation is much more stable than this godless, violent, powerful man. And that leads us to the next contrast, and that's a picture of what they are like. There is a reference to two trees in the psalm. There's a dead tree that's uprooted. Look with me in verse 5. The word tree is not used, but the picture is. Verse 5, but God will break you down forever. He will snatch you up and tear you away from your tent and uproot you from the land of the living. It's like a dead tree that needs to be pulled out of the ground. So there's the dead tree, and then there's the vibrant tree in verse 8. But as for me, I'm like a green olive tree in the house of God. He's a vibrant tree flourishing in God's presence. Very, very, very different image. I'll say a little bit more about this olive tree picture when we come to it. Let's go to the back side of your handout and the visual outline chart, and I'll use the screen from here to help us zero in. Up at the top is a purpose statement. Reeling from the destructive actions of Saul's strongman, Doeg, David pens a poem highlighting the futility of trusting in human strength and the unquenchable joy of trusting in Yahweh's faithful love. This is over in the upper right. It's a psalm of trust. It has within it a prophetic indictment, pronouncement of conviction, written by David. We could date this around the years 1015 to 1017. This is about 10 years before David would take the throne. This refers to the events and after 1 Samuel 22. Over on the far left, there are actually a number of different headings. There's the first one is that this is authorized for the choir director. Now that tells you right away. Now in the days of Doeg and Psalm, there was no choir director. So David at some point has edited this poem and then handed it over for the choir director to use in the tabernacle in his day. The authorship is by David. It's called a maskil, which seems to mean something like a song of instruction, or it might mean a song that's to be skillfully played. That is, you would put your best musicians in performing this song. And the last part of the heading is the historical setting, as we read before, when Doeg the Edomite came and told Saul and said to him, David has come to the house of Ahimelech. So then the poem itself starts in verses 1 to 4, and the beginning of this is an indictment, the exposure of the wicked man. The opening charge in verse 1 is about the folly of fighting the faithful God. So there's this mocking interrogation, a mocking question of the proud strong man that David opens up. Why do you boast in evil, O mighty man? You brag about the people you've killed, the battles you've won, the blood that you've shed. You think you're pretty amazing, but compared to the faithfulness of God, you're nothing. The second part of verse 1, the loving kindness of God endures all day long. And implied in that is a contrast that, you think you've got endurance, that you're creating a name for yourself, that your strength is going to go on, but it is nothing compared to the faithfulness of God. God is faithful to his people even when some of his people die. God's faithfulness is going to outlast your rage, your bloodletting. You're no match for him. God is more faithful than you are violent. And then beginning in verses 2 through 4, there are some accusations in this indictment of destructive dishonesty. He's conspiring to commit harm in verse 2. Your tongue devises destruction like a sharp razor, O worker of deceit. Obviously, the tongue doesn't have a brain, but it's like his mouth is thinking of some way to deceive people so he can get what he wants. No matter who he hurts, doesn't matter. It's like a razor doesn't care what it cuts. So is his tongue. Conspiring to commit harm. He's dedicated to doing evil, verse 3. You love evil more than good, which seems to mean you are dedicated to evil more than to doing good. Falsehood more than speaking what is right. And after that statement, there's a Salah, which is, it's an amazing statement. You are dedicated to doing evil. I mean, that is a shocking indictment. What an awful thing when there are people like that. We run into people like this, or we hear about people like this, and we just think, how can you be so twisted, so distorted? I was reading just this week about concentration camps that are popping up all over China, particularly Western China. And, I mean, unspeakable abuse. I suppose you could say at least they're not like Mao and just slaughtering people straight away, but it's just unconscionable. There are some people, for different reasons, who are dedicated to doing evil, and they've convinced themselves that it's the best thing for them to do. And then that sort of work often really requires deception. Verse 4, you love all words that devour, O deceitful tongue. It is dedicated to this destructive deception. David wasn't the first person that he'd feigned support for. This is a man who is skilled at tricking people, deceiving people, so he can get what he wants. And again, he doesn't care who he hurts, as long as he can advance himself. So that's the indictment. Verses 1 to 4. All of that is directed at this wicked man. And now we have in verses 5 through 7 the judgment. The verdict of God is received. Firstly, there is in verse 5 the announcement of God's judgment on the wicked man. Now, David is still speaking to Doeg, but he brings in the Lord into this. But God will break you down forever. He will snatch you up and tear you away from your tent. So that first phrase, he will break you down, in other passages is translated, leave as a heap of ruins. You're going to be torn down and destroyed. And then the second image, in the second part of verse 5, is he'll be uprooted like a dead tree. He will snatch you up, tear you away from your tent, and uproot you from the land of the living. Sometimes, now, Doeg, being a man with an agricultural business, would have used tents as he's out shepherding it. And sometimes you would build your tents around trees to give some extra stability. And, well, he's like the tree that's going to be uprooted. A dead tree, no place left in the good earth. And there's a Salah after this striking image to make us ponder the judgment that's to come. And then verses 6 and 7 focus on how the righteous are going to react when God finally does it, when God finally puts a stop to Doeg and people like him. They're going to have an awareness and a wonder at God's righteous work. Verse 6 says, the righteous will see and fear. And the fear is a good kind of fear. They're going to be filled with awe at what God has done. And they are going to appreciate God's justice. They will laugh at him. The idea is that they echo God's judgment. They agree, yes, what God has done in stopping him, it is good. It's bad for him, but it is good. It's righteous for this kind of evil to be put to a stop. It's the kind of laughter that God himself sometimes uses. Psalm 2 says that, they marvels at the fact that the kings of the world have assembled themselves against the Lord and against his Messiah and said, let us cast their bonds asunder from us. And we're told of the Lord in verse 4 of Psalm 2, he who sits in the heavens laughs. And again, it's not a maniacal kind of laugh. It's just, it's in God's case, it's sort of the laugh of disbelief. You really think you can beat me? Now, the laugh here is again more of a laugh of relief. Sorrow has been turned to laughter. And yes, Bob.
I was going to say, because in Proverbs, God says, you don't gloat, because if you gloat, I may remove my hand of punishment from the enemy.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. There are ways of... There are sometimes people who have a sinful a self-righteous kind of gloating when bad people get what's coming to them. It's that kind of attitude that says, God is going to damn you to hell, and I'm going to be standing at the door applauding. Now, that is not that's not the sentiment that you've got here. This is the sense of relief that evil has been stopped and God's people have been spared. And, God's people have an understanding of the folly of not putting their trust in the Lord. Of misplacing your trust outside of God is a foolish thing. Verse 7, they'll laugh at him saying, "Behold, the man who would not make God his refuge, but trusted in the abundance of his riches and was strong in his evil desire." So we've learned by God's grace to trust in him, to make him our fortress, not our weapons, not our wealth. The strong man may seem like he's getting away with a lot, but in the end, he's going to be brought down to nothing. Now, in this case, Doeg appears to have been stopped during his lifetime. We don't know when exactly, but we know within less than 10 years, the house of Saul completely falls, and the house of David rises supreme, and Doeg is to be found no more. But even if in this life we don't see the justice meted out like we might want to, there is a God who brings every man to judgment. And nobody is getting away with anything. Everyone's sins have to be dealt with. Either they are dealt with by the blood of Christ, or they are dealt with by the wrath of God. Those are the only two choices.
Yeah, I was going to say, sometimes people have a problem with that. It's, yeah, but this person was so bad. And yes, but God saved him and his sins are paid for. But this guy, he was just as bad. His sins are not paid for. Different outcome.
Yeah, that's right. Yes.
Sometimes we have trouble
Yeah.
reconciling that this guy was such a jerk. God
Yes,
saved him too.
that's right. Yes. That's the amazing thing of grace is the way it changes the price tags on things, isn't it? Well, the last part of the poem, verses 8 and 9, is a celebration. David is in relief. And there's a contrast painted now of the righteous man with the wicked man like Doeg. So verse 8, there's a confession of trust in God's loving kindness. There's an analogy that he's like an olive tree that's secure on sacred ground. But as for me, as opposed to you who's been indicted and is going to be judged, but as for me, I'm like a green olive tree in the house of God. Now, in David's day, the house of God wasn't doing that well, was it? It was, Doeg had just slaughtered all the priests there. But David would lead in the reestablishment of the tabernacle, the reestablishment of the temple. And one of the things you need to run a tabernacle or a temple is olive oil. Right? You need olive oil for the lamps and for some of the rituals. So, of course, there would be olive trees all around. Let's think about Jerusalem, where the tabernacle eventually gets put and then becomes a temple. What is the mountain, most famous mountain, next to Jerusalem? Mount of Olives. So, huge business there, not only feeding the temple's needs, but also the people as well. So, imagine if you are an olive tree in the tabernacle, not in the building itself, but on the grounds. That's pretty safe. God's very presence is there, tended and cared for, treated as a sacred thing. Now, David, even though he's on the run, even though he's living in a cave, he can say, I'm like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in your loving kindness forever and ever. Your loving kindness, the loving kindness of God forever and ever. There's a statement of trust in God's care. And then the psalm ends with a vow of thanksgiving and trust. There's a pledge in verse 9 to make ongoing thanks for God's righteous judgment. Verse 9, I will give you thanks forever because you have done it. Now remember, when you see in the Psalms, I will give thanks, that doesn't just mean I'm going to make happy songs in my heart, or I'm going to be internally grateful. That's at least there, but I will give thanks usually means I'm going to bring a thank offering. This is the same word that's used for that. Now, I don't think he's just making one promise that, one time I'm going to bring a thank offering. That this is the bent of his heart is to give free will offerings to God of thanks as much as he can, ongoingly for God's faithfulness. So there's a vow of ongoing thanks, and then he makes a pledge of ongoing trust. And the end of verse 9, and I will wait on your name, for it is good in the presence of your godly ones. There are other people like me who are trusting and waiting in the Lord. There are other righteous people. We may feel outnumbered. We may feel like sometimes we're not outnumbered, but we're outpowered. But nothing outlasts God's faithfulness. We have brothers and sisters in China, I mentioned it before, that are going through the ringer. And another one of their churches has been shut down. I saw on the news yesterday, unrelated to them, that Christians had gathered at church. The police came, dragged everybody out, and then destroyed the building in front of them. God's people often feel outnumbered, overpowered, but God is not defeated. And God's people are still in His care. His loving kindness endures forever. And our God is able to make all wrongs right. So, like David said here, I wait. Now, I don't know exactly when he wrote this poem. I imagine he edited it later on, but he might have been in the cave. Some of the Psalms we'll read in a little bit. He's going to be in the cave of Adullam. And yet, he trusts in God. So you and I, in the caves we find ourselves in the times when we feel overpowered and outnumbered, can take comfort that our God is able to keep us, and He's still with us, and He has a plan and a righteous judgment that will prevail. And that's good news. That's good news. Well, let's have a word of prayer and ask God to bless all the things we've learned this day. Father, we are grateful for our time of study this morning. We're thankful for the encouragement that comes from this psalm. Though it is full of strong words and harsh words, it is a good word that you, our righteous God, are faithful to us and will keep us to the end. So, Lord, keep us rooted in your faithfulness, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.